Welcome, I'm Professor Fred Long. I'd like to welcome you to Koine Greek Grammar. We're looking at Chapter 8. Here we're going to be looking at the imperfect tense, how it's formed, and what its significance is. We'll look particularly at augmentation, which is an epsilon added to the front of the verb stem to help mark the imperfect tense and indicate remoteness or past time. We'll then look at the imperfect forms of imi, and conclude by looking at important conjunctions, gar, oti, and e. So let's get started by looking at the vocabulary. Now I have indented verb forms that are compound, built off of the head verb there. So ago has compounded forms sunago and upago, and these have slightly different meanings. They have prepositions added to the front. And this happens with balo and then phero. So, ago, I lead, bring or carry. Sunago, I gather together. Upago, I depart or go away. Balo is I cast or throw. Ekbalo is I throw out or expel. Pasco is I suffer. Phero is I bear or carry or bring. Prosphero, I bring to or I offer. We also have some adverbs, ede, already or now, proton, first or before, tote, then or at that time, and we have prepositions. These prepositions will take two cases, the genitive and accusative, and the case of the object will determine the meaning of the preposition. You have kata, with the genitive as against, with the accusative according to. Meta, genitive with, accusative after or behind. Peri, with the genitive concerning or about, and the accusative around. And huper, with the genitive on behalf of or for, with the accusative above or over. Notice that kata and meta have alternative forms based upon the next word, whether it begins with a vowel, and whether it has a rough breathing mark. With a rough breathing mark, the tav will be aspirated to form a theta. We also have some very important conjunctions which are worthy of special mention in a final section in this chapter, gar, oti, and e. The imperfect tense is the second tense that you're going to be learning in this grammar. The significance of the imperfect tense is the same as that of the present tense. That is, the imperfect tense has imperfective aspect. Now, we're looking at the formation of tense. Tense can be marked by 5 different ways. Not all 5 ways are always present, but it's good to know that there's 5 different things that could happen to a verb stem, a lexical form, that can help indicate a change in tense. First of all, you have a prefix that may be added, and we're going to see that that's the case with the imperfect tense. The stem may also change slightly or sometimes greatly, and that can indicate tense. You can have a tense indicator, a special consonant, and then you have a coupling vowel, and then you have a set of endings. So let's look at the formation of the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense is partially marked by the presence of the augment. An augment is an epsilon added to the front of the verb stem. Now there's a couple other tenses that will also have augments, but they will have different tense indicators and different endings, and so that's how you'll be able to differentiate them from the imperfect tense. Now the augment is debated in terms of what it signifies. I think the best way to understand the augment, this epsilon added to the front, is that it indicates remoteness and therefore is often marking past time referent. So that's how we're going to understand the augment functioning in Koine Greek grammar. Now there are special rules for how to augment, and we'll look at those in just a moment. But first let's look at the endings which are added to the end of the stem to form the imperfect tense. These are called the secondary endings. And these secondary endings will have an omicron or epsilon coupling vowel. And so the endings are simply on, es, omen, ete, on. So that's the ending with the coupling vowel combined. Now we're going to talk about how to put the augment on, but many times it's just simply an epsilon. So we have the augment added to the verb stem, in this case pistev, and then we add the endings, and you should know how to do that. So we have pistevon, pistev es, pistev en, pistev omen, pistev ete, pistev on. And so this is how you form the imperfect tense. Now the middle passive endings are slightly different, and it's omein, u, eto, ometha, este, onto. Now you will recognize some of these endings. The ometha and este are the same as the middle passive primary endings, which you've seen on the present tense. And once again, you add these endings onto the verb, and you can see that as follows. The verbal aspect of the imperfect tense is imperfective. That is, the action of the verb is viewed internally as in progress or incomplete. Now, the imperfect tense is used most often in narrative, and what it does is it often represents action that is ongoing in a past time reference and can often be translated by an English past progressive. So here's how you might translate epistevon, I was trusting, and then you can see the second person, third person, plural as well. So you can see here then the middle or passive forms and how they might be translated, both passively or in terms of middle. Now the form for the middle and passive is the same. Now common uses of the imperfect tense have been identified, and these are labels in a sense that help us with our understanding of how to translate them into English or how they could be. And these are the 5 different ways that I've distilled. Progressive, which is ongoingness. Ingressive or inceptive, those are terms that might indicate the start of an action that then continues. Continuative, that is the continuation of action. Customary, or kind of repeated action that was customary. And then conative, which means that some action was attempted but not fulfilled. In later chapters, when we learn more past tenses in the indicative mood, it will become important for us to distinguish why an author might choose one past tense form instead of another. And so we'll look at that in chapter 13. Let's talk a little bit more about augmentation. Augmentation is the process of adding an epsilon, the augment, onto the verb stem. There's some complexities here because not all verb stems are the same. Some begin with vowels, some have prepositional prefixes, and so the augment will function differently to form to be added to the front of the verb stem. So simple augmentation is rather simple, that's why it's called simple. The augment is added directly to the verb stem. Now when verb stems begin with a vowel, what happens is the augment, the epsilon, will combine with the initial vowel of this verb stem, and there will be a lengthening of the vowel. So epsilon added to alphas or epsilons will result in etas at the front of the verb stem. So you can see these examples provided here. Now when an epsilon is added to an omicron, it results in an omega, which you can see in this example. Now there's also combination with diphthongs, and basically the same kind of rules apply. If the diphthong or monophthong has an alpha or an epsilon or an omega, there'll be a corresponding lengthening of that part of the monophthong or diphthong, and you can see the examples there. Now with compound verbs, that is verbs formed with prepositions, the augment is going to sneak behind the preposition to the front of the verb stem. Now what this effectively does is somewhat hide the augment. So it's going to be trickier for you to see the augment when you're looking at the verb to parse it, but you'll have to recognize it sneaking in behind and added to the front. So there's a discussion here that talks about that, and for some of these prepositions, the vowel will be replaced by the augment, as in apo. So look at and study these examples. One particularly odd formation of augmentation is with the verb echo, which becomes ikon. So rather than lengthening to an eta, the epsilons combine to form a monophthong. Well, let's look at the imperfect tense forms of emi. And you just simply have to memorize these. Amen, ace, ain, amen, or possibly ametha, eta, asan. So these are the imperfect forms of the verb ami. Be sure to do the checkpoint and practice parsing. Now finally, let's talk about some important conjunctions. Gar is a postpositive conjunction. Remember that postpositives occur second or third in the sentence. They're not the first word in the sentence, they're often the second. Gar is special because it marks continuity as well as support. Now, in inductive Bible study terms, we would call that substantiation. Gar will strengthen or support a previous assertion in argumentation. And one way that that is translated is with the word for in English. Now, that's not the for that means the preposition for a time, but for in terms of a conjunction. So be sure to read this discussion. It's often important to track an argument by following the logic that the gar supplies by indicating support and continuity of an argument. Hoti is a very dynamic conjunction. It can be used in a variety of ways. One way is that it also indicates support, particularly in the middle of a sentence. It can be used to support a previous statement. But unlike gar, oti is a subordinating conjunction. So we indicate that in our marking method with brackets. Oti can also indicate direct discourse. That is, before a direct quotation, oti may be located to mark that as a direct quote. Now, when it does so, it's a more marked construction because the ot is not always present. It's not needed. So ot may be present or may not be present. When it's present with a direct quotation, it's given a special name. It's called recitative ot, and you can read the discussion there. Somewhat confusingly, ot can also mark indirect discourse. In fact, it must be present to mark indirect discourse. So it sometimes is very difficult to distinguish between direct and indirect discourse, and sometimes there's exegetical debates about that. Now, with special verbs of hearing, knowing, believing, hoping, etc., ot can actually form a content clause. That is, it gives the content of what that verb is hoping or knowing, like I know that or I hope that. So hoti can function as what's called the content clause for special verbs of knowing, hearing, and believing. Finally, ot can function as an appositional clause. That is, a clause that further defines a previous statement. So in this example in Luke 10:20, in this do not rejoice that. So here the ot functions to give more specificity to a noun, and that's why it's called an appositional clause. A noun, or in this case a pronoun, the this is being clarified and specified by the hoti. Well, ot is very dynamic, and there's a summary there that you can look at to help you remember the different ways that this conjunction, subordinating conjunction, is used. Finally, E. E is a conjunction that begins a subordinate clause. It's used in conditional sentence as the if part of that sentence. So when you see an E, you can begin a subordinate clause. Now, sometimes it can also indicate an indirect question. It marks what had been asked originally. So in this example, Pilate wondered whether he had already died. So here, the E functions to mark an indirect question. We translate that in English with the word whether. As far as the conditional use, we'll talk more about that in our last chapter. Well, be sure that you read the case in point and consider whether Jesus' ministry is imperfect or not.